Welcome back to another deep lore sleep narration. Tonight, we're journeying to the very beginning of the Hunger Games world, long before the reaping, before the arenas, before Katniss Everdeen ever volunteered as tribute. We're going back to the days before Panem even existed, to the collapse of North America and the dark years that followed, when humanity was struggling to survive and the seeds of the capital's tyranny were first planted. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm, in-depth explorations of your favorite fictional worlds, please consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel out more than you'd know, and it lets me know you want more of these deep dives into the lore that makes these stories so rich. And if these videos help you learn something new or drift off to sleep, drop a comment below. I love hearing from you. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's explore the ancient history of Panem. Our story begins not in the totalitarian, metallic world of Panem, but in the ruins of the world that came before, a world so much like our own that its fate serves as a terrifying, whispered prophecy. The collapse of the old world was not a sudden, singular event, but a long, drawn-out decline fueled by two unstoppable forces: environmental catastrophe and widespread global warfare. First came the devastating changes to the planet itself. The intricate balance of climate and nature, which had supported human civilization for millennia, finally broke down under the strain of unchecked consumption and industrial output. The key event in this environmental collapse was the dramatic and irreversible rise in global sea levels. Coastlines, which had defined the borders of nations and the locations of great cities, were utterly submerged. Vast stretches of land vanished beneath the waves, fundamentally altering the continental landmasses and wiping out massive population centers, resources, and established infrastructure. This initial environmental shock, though catastrophic in its own right, was only the prelude to the true end of civilization. The disappearance of land and the loss of fertile ground immediately triggered a brutal, global war for remaining resources. Nations that had once traded peacefully turned on one another in a desperate scramble for arable land, clean water, and access to the dwindling energy reserves. These were not wars fought for ideology or politics. They were wars of pure survival, where the goal was not conquest, but the annihilation of rivals to secure the last remaining means of subsistence. The conflicts were likely fought using the devastating arsenal of advanced weaponry that the old world had developed, ensuring that the battles were brief, total, and completely destructive to the environment and the population. This period was one of profound chaos and savagery. Governments failed, supply chains collapsed entirely, and the rule of law vanished, replaced by local warlords, roaming gangs, and communities reduced to fighting tooth and nail over scraps of food and fuel. The global population, already diminished by the environmental disasters, was decimated further by the ensuing violence, famine, and disease. It was an age where humanity turned upon itself with a nihilistic efficiency, ensuring that the highly complex, interconnected systems of the old civilization would never be resurrected. The knowledge, technology, and sheer number of people required to maintain the old world were lost forever, leaving behind only ruins, toxic wastelands, and a small number of scattered, terrified survivors. From the ashes of this self-inflicted apocalypse, a new order slowly began to coalesce. The narrative shifts to the rugged terrain of North America, specifically the remnants of what was once the massive mountain chain known as the Rocky Mountains. It was here, in the relatively protected, geographically isolated, and resource-rich interior, that the foundations of a new nation were laid. This nation, born from the brutal necessity of centralized control and the fear of repeating the past, was named Panem. The founders of Panem, whoever they were, likely a core group of military leaders, scientists, and surviving elites, were driven by one guiding principle: absolute totalitarian control. They were convinced that human freedom and decentralized power had been the cause of the global collapse, and that only through extreme oppression and perfect societal control could humanity avoid extinction. Panem was conceived as a self-contained, perfectly regulated ecosystem. The central government and its elite population established themselves in the fortress-like capital, known simply as the capital. The capital became a place of hyper-advanced technology, wealth, and abundance, starkly contrasted against the surrounding ruins. Its entire existence, however, depended utterly on the forced labor and resources extracted from 12, and originally 13, outlying regions. These regions, carefully delineated and geographically separated, were designated as districts, each assigned a specific, non-negotiable role in the new totalitarian economic machine. This division of labor, this forced specialization, was the ingenious and terrifying solution Panem devised to ensure no single part of the society could become self-sufficient and thus threaten the central authority again. The foundation of Panem was, by its very nature, a permanent state of political and economic warfare between the capital and its subjugated periphery. The central location and design of the capital were paramount to the foundational ideology of Panem. Settled deep within the protected valleys of the Rocky Mountains, the capital was geographically secured, making it difficult to attack, infiltrate, or even easily reach from the distant, resource-producing districts. Its physical location served as a powerful symbol of its isolation and its ultimate authority, elevated high above the suffering and toil of the peripheral regions. From its inception, the capital was designed to be a self-contained technological marvel, a hub of luxury and scientific advancement that was not meant to improve the lives of all Panem citizens, but rather to serve and protect the ruling elite. The capital's infrastructure was built on the ruins of old-world technology, but its implementation was entirely totalitarian. While the districts were provided with just enough basic technology to perform their assigned resource production tasks, the capital hoarded the most advanced science for itself. This included advanced medicine, highly efficient transportation systems, sophisticated surveillance networks, and, crucially, the technology used for game making and arena design. The capital's citizens, the elite class of Panem, were deliberately sheltered from the grim realities of the outside world, living lives of opulent excess, vibrant fashion, and constant, shallow entertainment, all manufactured and sustained by the forced labor of the districts. The true structure of Panem, however, lay in its 13, or later 12, outlying districts. Each district was created to be a single, specialized cog in the capital's industrial machine, stripped of any kind of diverse economy. This enforced specialization was the master stroke of the capital's totalitarian control, preventing any single district from producing everything it needed to sustain itself. For instance, District 12 was the sole provider of coal, the primary fuel source, while District 4 was restricted to fishing and seafaring. District 9 grew the grain, but lacked the textiles provided by District 8 to make clothing. This system of absolute reliance on the capital for the distribution of essential, finished goods ensured that the districts could never truly function without the central government. Furthermore, the capital ruthlessly enforced a policy of total isolation between the districts. Travel, communication, and especially trade between any two districts were strictly forbidden under penalty of death. This was a critical security measure designed to prevent the districts from realizing their collective power. If District 3, which specialized in technology and electronics, were allowed to communicate and trade with District 4, the fishing district, they could begin to build their own independent infrastructure, exchange information, and, most importantly, organize politically. By isolating them, the capital ensured that each district saw itself only as a solitary, struggling entity, utterly dependent on the capital's benevolence for for the resources, like grain, medicine, and fuel, that they could not produce themselves. The system was a perfect engine of exploitation. The capital would set impossibly high quotas for each district, taking the vast majority of the produced resources, and then return only a tiny fraction of what was produced back to the district in the form of finished goods and basic necessities. This guaranteed a state of perpetual manufactured poverty and starvation in the districts, where the citizens were forced to work grueling hours for minimal sustenance. This deliberate, systematic exploitation of labor created the immense wealth and luxury enjoyed by the capital, solidifying the economic disparity that was the bedrock of Panem's existence. The seeds of the inevitable rebellion were sown not just in political cruelty, but in the calculated, grinding poverty imposed by this forced industrial dependence. This economic oppression, sustained over decades, turned the districts into simmering cauldrons of resentment, awaiting the inevitable spark that would ignite the dark days. The 13 districts of early Panem were far more than just geographic regions. They were carefully engineered economic prisons, each designed to strip the land of a singular resource for the exclusive benefit of the capital. Understanding the specific function and culture of the original 13 is vital to grasping the systemic exploitation that led to the Dark Days Rebellion. District 1 was designated to produce luxury goods, items like jewelry, fine silks, and ornamentation for the capital's elite. Its citizens were often considered the most privileged among the districts, living in relative comfort due to the nature of their valuable, non-essential trade. This relative proximity to luxury often instilled a greater loyalty to the capital, making them the most compliant of the districts, and later earning them the title of a career district in the games. District 2 served as the center for masonry and arms production, providing the capital with essential weapons, armor, and the stone used for its elaborate architecture. Geographically close to the capital, it also served as the primary military and training hub for the capital's peacekeepers. Much like District 1, this proximity to power and military focus made them deeply entrenched with the capital's ideology, fostering a culture of loyalty and martial skill that also translated into a career district mentality. District 3 specialized in electronics, technology, and engineering. They produced the televisions, communication gear, and the basic computers used by the capital. Crucially, they also produced the rudimentary surveillance equipment and the internal security tech for the capital's forces. Yet, this specialization meant their citizens were intellectually sharp, possessing the theoretical knowledge to dismantle or reprogram the very systems that oppressed them, making them a quiet source of highly educated resentment. District 4 was dedicated entirely to fishing and the sea, supplying the capital with all of its seafood, a necessary but easily controlled resource. Their culture was tied to the unforgiving nature of the ocean, making them hardy and resourceful, skills that would later make them formidable tributes in the games, joining the ranks of the career districts. District 5 was the power generation hub of Panem, responsible for supplying the massive amounts of electricity required to run the capital's luxurious cities and advanced technology. This control over the electric grid made them a critical but extremely vulnerable asset, and their citizens worked under constant, intense scrutiny due to the strategic nature of their output. District 6 focused on transportation, maintaining the complex network of roads, railways, and hovercraft that connected the capital to its resource periphery. Their knowledge of logistics and movement meant they had a unique, though dangerous, understanding of Panem's geographic layout and vulnerabilities. District 7 was the source of all the capital's lumber and wood products. The citizens were often highly skilled with axes and knives, operating in the vast, dense forests, a physical toughness that made them resilient, but often isolated from the rest of the nation. District 8 was the textile district, responsible for producing clothing, fabrics, and the opulent, vibrant materials used in the capital's high fashion. Their job was to manufacture the visible symbols of the capital's vanity, even as their own children lived in rags. District 9 was the main provider of grain and agricultural foodstuffs, growing the vast crops required to feed the entire nation, including the capital's massive, consuming population. Their toil was unending, tied directly to the rhythms of the land, yet they were often the first to suffer from famine when the capital raised its quotas. District 10 focused on livestock and meat production, running large ranches to supply the capital's dining tables. Their work often required a rough, rugged independence and a familiarity with the tools of slaughter. District 11 specialized in orchards and agriculture, particularly the exotic fruits and vegetables consumed by the capital's wealthy. Located far to the south, its large fields and oppressive heat made its population easily exploited and its produce easily harvested. District 12, the most impoverished of all, was the sole supplier of coal, the essential fuel for power and heat. Its citizens lived in crushing poverty, forced to risk their lives in dangerous mine shafts to keep the entire nation warm and running. Finally, District 13, the true anomaly, was Panem's military-industrial and nuclear complex. They provided the capital with its most advanced weaponry, aircraft, and, most crucially, its nuclear deterrent capabilities. This unique, self-sufficient military focus meant that District 13 possessed a power utterly unlike the other 12, a fact that would profoundly determine the course of the future Dark Days Rebellion. This enforced, isolating specialization was the ticking time bomb of Panem, a system designed for control that eventually guaranteed its own explosive, violent unraveling. The long-term maintenance of Panem's structure was secured not just through military might and surveillance, but through a calculated, deliberate policy of manufactured scarcity and total dependence. The capital understood a core truth about revolution. It requires organization, communication, and self-sufficiency. By strategically depriving the districts of any means to achieve these three elements, the capital created a nearly unbreakable system of control that endured for decades. The enforced isolation and the one-resource specialization were the primary tools of this economic oppression. The capital ensured that every single district, no matter how vital its primary resource, was lacking in at least one or two fundamental necessities of life. For example, while District 9 grew massive fields of grain, the capital would control the processing, milling, and distribution of that grain, returning a small, often insufficient amount of finished flour or bread back to the district. Similarly, the coal mined by District 12 was vital, but the capital would restrict the flow of finished medical supplies, or even basic tools that District 12 could not forge themselves. This created a profound sense of helplessness. No matter how hard the citizens toiled, they could never earn enough to fully feed themselves, clothe themselves, or heal themselves without the central intervention of the capital. This forced reliance on the capital for basic resource distribution was constantly underscored by the threat of withdrawal. If a district failed to meet its quotas, or if the capital merely wished to exert its power, the flow of essential goods, from medicine to fuel, would be immediately and ruthlessly curtailed. This tactic was a powerful form of economic warfare, quickly reducing the already minimal caloric intake and quality of life in the districts, plunging them further into poverty and starvation. The citizens were not fighting for luxury. They were perpetually fighting for survival, trapped in a cycle where they had to keep working just to avoid total famine, reinforcing the system of indentured labor. The strict prohibition on inter-district travel and trade served an equally important psychological purpose. It prevented the 12, later 11, oppressed regions from developing a sense of shared identity or collective grievance. The people of the lumber-focused District 7 had no idea of the specific hardships faced by the textile workers of District 8, nor did they know the extent of the immense, unimaginable wealth enjoyed by the capital. This information blackout was crucial. By keeping the districts isolated, the capital could manage the narrative, ensuring that each district believed its own suffering was unique, making the idea of a continental, unified rebellion seem utterly impossible. However, the laws of the capital, no matter how strictly enforced, were not strong enough to completely stifle human nature and the instinct for survival. This relentless pressure of scarcity and isolation ironically led to the development of the black market. Driven by hunger and desperation, citizens began to risk their lives to cross the heavily guarded borders, forging small, secret networks of exchange. In District 12, for instance, citizens would risk meeting in the illegal space of the fence and woods to trade coal for wild game and medicinal herbs, or to trade their few manufactured goods for the illicit bread and cheese smuggled from other areas. These black market exchanges, while small, were the only places where the districts could taste a tiny, rebellious morsel of self-determination and mutual support. These small, illegal networks of trade represented the first, quiet acts of defiance. They were physical and emotional spaces where the isolation doctrine of the capital failed, allowing the citizens to realize that their survival lay not with the distant, oppressive capital, but with each other. It was here, in the shadows and across the dangerous borders, that the first seeds of genuine unity and the true potential for a collective, organized rebellion were sown, slowly preparing the ground for the massive upheaval known as the Dark Days. The seeds of the Dark Days were sown long before the first shot was fired, cultivated in the deliberate economic inequality and psychological oppression imposed by the capital. For decades, the citizens of the 13 districts endured a systematic exploitation that was not accidental, but the very foundation of Panem's wealth and security. The high quotas, the low returns of finished goods, and the ruthless control over resource distribution meant that life in the districts was a constant, grueling struggle against famine and disease. This pervasive, manufactured scarcity eventually pushed the districts past the point of simple compliance and into a state of simmering resentment that demanded an outlet. The economic reality of the districts meant that official labor, working the mines, fields, or factories for the capital, was never enough to sustain a family. This desperation forced people into risky, illegal ventures, creating and expanding the black market systems. These underground exchanges, though violently suppressed by the peacekeepers, were crucial in two ways. First, they provided a necessary lifeline, allowing families to trade illicit goods for essential medicine or food. Second, and more importantly, they fostered the very inter-district communication the capital had desperately tried to prevent. While direct travel was nearly impossible, information began to flow along the clandestine routes of the black market. Smugglers, traders, and those who risked crossing the borders to hunt or scavenge became the unintentional carriers of news and common grievances. Through these secretive channels, the people of District 7, who worked with lumber, learned of the crippling mining quotas in District 12. The grain farmers of District 9 heard whispers of the near starvation faced by the fishermen in District 4 when their catch quota was raised unreasonably high. This shared intelligence was revolutionary. It allowed the citizens to realize that their suffering was not unique or isolated, but systemic. The capital's policy of isolation began to fail when the districts realized that their individual tragedies were actually parts of a unified, continental exploitation scheme. A sense of shared identity, the oppressed districts versus the ruling capital, slowly crystallized in the shadows of the illegal marketplaces. The ideological foundation for the rebellion also began to take shape. The citizens realized that they were not merely servants, but slaves in an industrial machine. The wealth they created, the rich silks of District 8, the fine food of District 11, the advanced electronics of District 3, was being used to fuel the capital's grotesque vanity and self-indulgence. While their own children suffered from malnourishment and died from preventable diseases. This moral outrage, combined with the economic desperation, provided the necessary motivation for a widespread uprising. The people were not just fighting for a better life. They were fighting for the right to self-determination, the right to control the fruits of their own labor, and the right to exist outside the constant, threatening shadow of the peacekeepers. The peacekeepers, the military force of the capital, were often the immediate targets of this growing resentment. Composed of men and women from both the capital and sometimes the districts themselves, loyalists who had betrayed their own kind. The peacekeepers enforced the impossible quotas and the brutal laws with indiscriminate violence. Their presence, designed to instill order and fear, became the physical embodiment of the capital's tyranny. Every public whipping, every execution for smuggling, every instance of forced labor served as a rallying point and a potent reminder that the capital ruled through naked, unadulterated force. It was this sustained cruelty, both economic and physical, that pushed the simmering resentment into the outright conflagration known as the Dark Days, turning the exploited districts into a unified, vengeful front. The collective, boiling resentment of the districts finally erupted into the devastating civil war known as the Dark Days, a conflict that is perpetually recalled by the capital as an act of singular, ungrateful treachery. The rebellion began approximately 74 years before the events of the first Hunger Games movie, and it was not a sudden, unified uprising, but a series of calculated, simultaneous acts of defiance across the vast expanse of Panem. The long-suppressed forces of economic and moral outrage finally broke free, transforming the industrial exploitation zones into volatile battlefields. The initial spark of the rebellion is believed to have originated in one of the heavily militarized districts, likely District 2 or District 13, where the citizens possessed the organizational skills and access to basic military technology necessary for a coordinated attack. Once the signal was given, the rebellion spread like wildfire. The districts immediately recognized that their greatest strength lay in crippling the capital's infrastructure and resource flow. District 6 targeted the capital's main rail lines and transport hubs, disrupting the flow of essential goods and military reinforcements. District 5 attempted to seize control of the massive power generation facilities, aiming to plunge the capital into darkness and chaos. The initial success of the districts was startling. The peacekeepers, though well-armed, were often stationed in smaller, isolated garrisons across the districts, easily overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of desperate, determined rebels. However, the rebel forces were severely hampered by their lack of central organization and unified military training. While District 2 provided men skilled in combat and arms production, and District 3 provided engineers capable of rudimentary sabotage, the majority of the district citizens were miners, farmers, and textile workers, wielding tools and scavenged items against the capital's professional military might. The entire course of the war was immediately dictated by the critical, dominant role of District 13. This district was an anomaly, officially responsible for graphite mining. Its true function was as the military-industrial and nuclear complex of Panem. District 13 was completely self-sufficient, possessing its own advanced technological infrastructure, underground military bunkers, and, most critically, a formidable nuclear arsenal. They were the only district capable of manufacturing war-grade weapons, aircraft, and sophisticated electronic warfare equipment. Therefore, District 13 did not simply join the rebellion, it effectively led it, becoming the central command and supply hub for the uncoordinated district forces. Under the leadership of District 13, the rebellion briefly transformed into a true military force. District 13 supplied the other districts with vital tactical information, communication devices, and where possible, small shipments of actual military weapons. This flow of arms and intelligence allowed the districts to sustain the fight for an extended period, inflicting heavy casualties on the capital's military and successfully disrupting their command and control structure. The sheer scale of the rebellion, 13 districts rising up simultaneously, was an existential threat to the capital, forcing the ruling elite to mobilize their entire security apparatus and rapidly escalate the conflict from a riot into a full-scale war for survival. The capital could not simply suppress this rebellion. They had to win the war, and to do so, they had to destroy the infrastructure and spirit of the districts that had dared to challenge their ultimate authority. The history of Panem is fundamentally shaped by the military and technological power of District 13, the one area that possessed the capability for true parity and perhaps even supremacy over the capital. District 13's specialization was unique. They controlled the vast graphite mines, but their true strategic value lay in the military-industrial complex and the nuclear weapons program. They manufactured the capital's entire military fleet, including its hovercraft, advanced weaponry, and its nuclear arsenal, granting them a terrifying, self-contained power base. This specialization meant that District 13 was not oppressed in the same manner as the other 12. While its people still labored, they were highly educated, technically skilled, and lived in a sophisticated, largely subterranean environment dedicated to defense and manufacturing. They possessed their own self-sufficient power grid, vast underground food production facilities, and advanced military training. When the dark days began, District 13 was therefore perfectly poised to take the leadership role, commanding the rebel forces with an organized, technologically superior approach that the other districts simply could not match. The war between District 13 and the capital's military was fought on a scale that dwarfed the other fronts of the rebellion. District 13, with its own aircraft and advanced weaponry, engaged the capital in prolonged aerial skirmishes and ground battles around the capital's borders. Their greatest strength, however, lay in their nuclear deterrent. At some point during the escalating conflict, District 13 managed to separate itself from the capital's direct control, essentially creating an independent military state on the fringe of Panem. This independence was maintained by the simple, horrifying threat that they could launch a nuclear strike on the capital if they were attacked directly. The threat was real and undeniable. The capital knew that launching a total, direct assault on District 13 would guarantee a mutual nuclear annihilation, destroying the capital, its elite population, and the entire infrastructure of the nation it depended on. The ruling elite, driven by self-preservation above all else, were therefore forced into a position of weakness. The war was not going well for the capital, and the continued fighting across the other 12 districts was becoming too costly and politically destabilizing. Faced with the choice between total victory and total annihilation, the capital's leadership chose a third path, a secret peace treaty. The exact terms of this covert treaty are one of the most guarded secrets of Panem history. It is believed that District 13 agreed to cease hostilities and withdraw from the rebellion in exchange for guaranteed autonomy and non-interference from the capital. District 13 would effectively be allowed to exist as an independent, sovereign state, but they would remain hidden, concealed from the rest of the world, and Panem. To enforce this, District 13 agreed to dismantle their nuclear capabilities and transfer them to the capital's control, likely retaining only a small, highly protected military force for self-defense. In return for its autonomy, District 13 was required to play a crucial role in the capital's propaganda. The capital, unable to admit that it had been forced into a concession by a single district, publicly announced that District 13 had been utterly obliterated by the capital's superior military power, destroyed in a final, devastating show of force. The district was presented as a smoking, irradiated ruin, a terrible example of the fate that awaited any district that dared to challenge the capital's rule. This lie, constantly reinforced over the decades, became a powerful piece of propaganda, fueling the narrative that the capital was utterly invincible and that all rebellion would result in complete destruction, a belief that ensured the submission of the remaining 12 districts. The strategic withdrawal of District 13 under the terms of the secret treaty was the ultimate military turning point of the Dark Days Rebellion. Stripped of its main source of military command, advanced weaponry, and tactical support, the rebellion in the remaining 12 districts immediately began to unravel. The citizens who had initially risen up with such determination were now isolated, poorly armed, and facing the full, terrifying might of the capital's remaining military forces, who were now free from the threat of nuclear retaliation. The capital's victory was swift, merciless, and designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. This final phase of the war was not about military strategy. It was about punishment and terror. The capital systematically used its superior hovercraft, bombing capabilities, and professional peacekeeper armies to crush the remaining pockets of resistance. Districts that had shown fierce defiance were subjected to brutal sieges, massive airstrikes, and the complete destruction of their key production facilities. The capital's goal was not merely to defeat the rebels, but to obliterate their capacity to ever fight again. Historical accounts, though heavily sanitized by capital propaganda, whisper of massive atrocities committed during this period. Public executions became commonplace. Entire families suspected of harboring rebels were rounded up, and food supplies were deliberately poisoned or burned to hasten the surrender of besieged areas. The capital employed scorched earth tactics, ensuring that the remaining 12 districts were not only militarily defeated, but also reduced to a state of near total economic collapse and famine. The psychological warfare was relentless. The capital made sure that the leaders of the rebellion were publicly tortured, humiliated, and executed in graphic, broadcasted displays meant to instill generations of paralyzing fear. The rebellion finally collapsed under the weight of this systematic brutality and the overwhelming military power of the capital. Starving, decimated, and utterly terrified, the remaining leaders of the 12 districts were forced to surrender unconditionally. The formal end of the Dark Days came with the signing of the Treaty of Treason, a document that was far more than a simple peace accord. It was a formal codification of the district's total defeat, their perpetual servitude, and the permanent, brutal penalties imposed to ensure that no future rebellion could ever be conceived. The signing ceremony, often depicted in capital history books, with the defeated leaders looking gaunt and broken, was a triumphalist piece of propaganda, ensuring that every citizen of Panem knew the price of defiance. The most immediate and devastating consequence of the Treaty of Treason was the imposition of the annual Hunger Games. The games were conceived not as a random punishment, but as the ultimate, systemic weapon of psychological control. They served a triple purpose. First, as a perpetual, annual reminder of the district's total military defeat and their perpetual subservience to the capital. Second, as a direct punishment for the rebellion, forcing the districts to sacrifice their own children in a bloody, televised ritual. And third, to further break the spirits of the people by forcing them to watch their children kill each other, transforming the act of self-sacrifice into a horrifying spectacle of mutual destruction. The treaty enshrined this ritual sacrifice as the central pillar of Panem's political life, ensuring that the legacy of the Dark Days would never be forgotten, and guaranteeing that the people would forever be bound by fear and forced complicity in their own oppression. The official narrative of the capital concerning the end of the Dark Days, civil war, is a carefully constructed lie, a triumphalist story of military genius and overwhelming power, resulting in the complete and utter obliteration of District 13. This propaganda, which was ceaselessly repeated to all subsequent generations across Panem, served as the ultimate psychological deterrent, a chilling example of the price of defiance. However, the true history, locked away in the deepest vaults of the capital's archives, tells a far more complicated story, one rooted in desperation and the profound fear of mutual destruction. The reality is that District 13 was not destroyed. It was neutralized in a desperate secret negotiation. As the rebellion raged, District 13, with its sophisticated military-industrial complex and its formidable nuclear arsenal, became an existential problem the capital could not solve through conventional warfare. A direct assault on District 13 carried the undeniable risk of a full-scale nuclear retaliation, which would have meant the end of the capital, its elite population, and the entire dystopian system they had built. The leaders of the capital, driven by self-preservation and the desire to maintain their luxurious existence, recognized that sacrificing the core of Panem for a symbolic military victory was an act of complete folly. The peace treaty negotiated between the capital and District 13 was therefore a secret accord, a profound act of political expediency and betrayal. The specific, non-negotiable terms dictated that District 13 would immediately and permanently cease all military support for the remaining 12 rebel districts. This withdrawal was the strategic death blow to the wider rebellion, which relied entirely on District 13's command, weaponry, and advanced technology. In exchange, the capital granted District 13 autonomy and non-interference, allowing them to continue to exist as a separate, self-contained entity. However, this existence had to be entirely subterranean and highly regulated. Crucially, to maintain the appearance of their public obliteration and to reduce the military threat, District 13 was forced to dismantle and surrender the majority of their visible weapons and aircraft, transferring them to the capital's military control. More importantly, they had to agree to the capital's massive propaganda effort. They would become a ghost district, a powerful but invisible military facility that officially did not exist. The capital ensured that from that day forward, every map, every historical account, and every official census of Panem listed only 12 districts, with District 13 marked as a toxic, uninhabitable wasteland, destroyed by the very weapons it had created. The consequence of this secret peace was immediate and devastating for the remaining 12 districts. When the rebellion's central command vanished and the flow of military support abruptly ended, the resistance instantly collapsed. They were left to face the full, unbridled fury of the capital's forces, who were now free to crush the remaining rebellion with unrestrained brutality. The citizens of the 12 districts were forced to sign the Treaty of Treason, utterly unaware that the most powerful force in their rebellion had not been destroyed by the capital, but had simply negotiated its own survival, leaving them to face the consequences alone. The betrayal of District 13, hidden under layers of capital deceit, was one of the cruelest ironies of the Dark Days, ensuring the absolute subjugation of the entire continent for generations to come. With the strategic withdrawal of District 13 and the remaining rebels stripped of leadership and supply, the final phase of the Dark Days was a horrifying military mop-up orchestrated by the capital. The war ended not with a grand surrender, but with the systematic, brutal crushing of the 12 remaining districts. The sheer devastation inflicted by the capital during this final military push was designed to achieve 3 goals: total physical destruction of infrastructure, annihilation of future military capacity, and the infliction of paralyzing, generational fear. The capital was relentless in its attack on the vital economic hubs of the districts. District 5's power plants were disabled, and its generators were crippled, plunging large sections of the nation into darkness. The key factories and industrial centers of District 3 and District 8 were bombed from the air, ensuring that the technology and textile industries could not support any future military effort. The agricultural lands of District 9 and District 11 were often subjected to scorched earth tactics, with crops deliberately burned or poisoned, directly resulting in massive famine and starvation among the already defeated populations. The capital understood that infrastructure could be rebuilt, but the spirit of rebellion had to be broken completely. Therefore, the military campaign was intensely personal and political. Peacekeeper forces were authorized to conduct sweeping arrests, public interrogations, and summary executions of any citizen suspected of holding a leadership role or expressing dissent. The defeated rebels were deliberately stripped of their dignity and humanity. Public displays of torture and execution were often filmed and distributed to other districts, serving as a visceral, undeniable lesson in obedience. This period cemented the peacekeepers as the brutal enforcers of the capital's totalitarian rule, turning them into the most feared symbol of oppression. The culmination of this systematic destruction and terror was the forced signing of the Treaty of Treason. This document was a symbol of absolute, unconditional surrender, dictated entirely by the victorious capital. It contained a set of ruthless, non-negotiable terms designed to ensure the perpetual subservience of the districts. The treaty formalized the military occupation of the 12 districts, permanently stationing peacekeepers in every single sector, effectively turning them into prison colonies. It codified the strict resource quotas and the absolute prohibition of inter-district communication or travel, reinforcing the structure of totalitarian control that had been in place before the rebellion, but now, with a far more violent enforcement mechanism. Most devastatingly, the treaty included the foundational law that established the annual Hunger Games. This ritual was not an afterthought. It was the psychological centerpiece of the capital's strategy for long-term control. The capital knew that military defeat alone was not enough. They needed to destroy the very will of the people. By forcing each district to annually offer 2 of its own children, 1 boy and 1 girl, to fight to the death in a televised spectacle, the capital achieved an ultimate form of psychological warfare. The districts were not just defeated, they were forced to participate in their own punishment, to watch their children kill each other, transforming their grief into a spectacle and their rebellion into a ritual of bloody submission. The Treaty of Treason thus served as the legal cornerstone of the entire dystopian system, marking the official end of the dark days and the beginning of the long, terrifying reign of the 74 years of the Games. The Treaty of Treason is the most significant, oppressive, legal document in the history of Panem, marking the transition from a period of chaotic civil war to one of institutionalized, ritualistic terror. It was not a document created for negotiation or fairness, but for the codification of perpetual punishment and the establishment of a centralized, fear-based regime. The treaty's primary goal was to ensure that the rebellion of the Dark Days would never, under any circumstances, be repeated. The terms of the document went far beyond simple resource control. The treaty immediately mandated the complete disarmament of the districts. All firearms, advanced mechanical tools, and any technology that could be converted into weaponry were seized by the peacekeepers. This forced reliance on rudimentary tools and manual labor ensured that any future uprising would be fought with hands and farming implements against the capital's high-powered rifles and armored vehicles, guaranteeing a quick, decisive victory for the central government. The strict limitations on technology also served to reinforce the economic disparity, making the districts technologically dependent on the capital even for basic maintenance. Furthermore, the treaty reinforced the capital's totalitarian control over the flow of information. All forms of mass media, including radio, print, and later television, were brought under the direct, exclusive censorship of the capital. Any unauthorized communication, journalism, or education was punishable by death. This was a critical measure to prevent the spread of revolutionary ideas, to control the memory of the dark days, and to ensure that the capital's propaganda, particularly the narrative of the invincible peacekeepers and the necessity of the Hunger Games, went unchallenged. The districts became isolated bubbles of enforced ignorance, knowing only the narrow version of history permitted by their oppressors. The most infamous and enduring clause of the Treaty of Treason was the explicit, non-negotiable mandate for the annual Hunger Games. This clause made the ritual sacrifice of the district's children a compulsory, eternal law, a foundational component of the Panem Constitution. It stipulated that each of the 12 surviving districts must hold a reaping ceremony every year, where one young man and one young woman between the ages of 12 and 18 would be selected as tributes to fight to the death. The rules were simple, brutal, and broadcast to the entire nation. Only one tribute could survive. The games were thus legally enshrined as a national festival, a compulsory spectacle designed to replace genuine political discourse with ritualized violence. The treaty also established the rules of engagement for the peacekeepers, granting them near absolute authority within the districts. The peacekeepers were not viewed as traditional police. They were an occupying military force, with license to use lethal force, public torture, and summary justice for even minor infractions. This legal impunity fostered an atmosphere of constant terror and allowed the capital to maintain order with a relatively small force, relying on the fear of retribution to keep the millions of district citizens in check. The legal language of the Treaty of Treason was the capital's cold, absolute proof that the citizens of the districts were not citizens at all, but a defeated enemy whose only right was to labor and to watch their children die. The document, therefore, stands as a chilling artifact of systemic oppression, the official marker of the end of freedom and the beginning of ritualized control. The institutionalization of the Hunger Games did not occur by accident. It was a carefully calculated, three-tiered psychological weapon crafted by the victorious capital to ensure the permanent subjugation of the 12 districts. Its creation, immediately following the signing of the Treaty of Treason, was an act of political genius disguised as a horrific penalty. The capital understood that physical defeat was temporary, but psychological defeat could last forever. The games were designed to weaponize fear, despair, and internal conflict. The first, most explicit purpose of the games was as a brutal annual reminder of military defeat. By forcing the districts to offer their children, the capital ensured that every year, every single citizen was reminded that the dark days had been lost, and that the ultimate price of rebellion was the sacrifice of the future generation. The elaborate spectacle of the reaping ceremony, with its mandatory attendance, the reading of the Treaty of Treason, and the visible presence of the peacekeepers, served as a powerful, repeated ritual of subservience. It reinforced the idea that the capital held absolute power over life and death, even over the most cherished members of the community. The second, more subtle purpose was to foster internal conflict and break the spirits of the districts. The games forced the districts to confront the horrific spectacle of their own children fighting each other. When a tribute from District 7 killed a tribute from District 9, it did more than simply end a life. It prevented the two districts from ever seeing themselves as true, potential allies. The games deliberately engineered a horrifying manufactured form of mutual destruction, replacing the former unity of the dark days with a deep, pervasive sense of isolation and distrust. If a district could not trust another district, how could they ever organize a unified rebellion? The games turned the district's children into unwilling instruments of the capital's divide and conquer strategy. The third, and most Machiavellian, purpose was to create a perverse form of mass entertainment and distraction for the capital's own citizens. This strategy is best encapsulated by the ancient Latin phrase Panem et circenses, meaning bread and circuses. By providing the capital populace with an endless supply of luxurious food, advanced technology, and the ultimate, bloody spectacle of the games, the ruling elite ensured their own stability. The capital citizens became completely consumed by the trivialities of the games, the fashions, the drama, the commentary, distracted from the serious political and ethical reality of their lives. This constant state of shallow excitement and moral complacency ensured that the capital itself would never experience the desire for revolution, as their hunger for blood and entertainment was perpetually sated. The early games, established immediately after the treaty, were somewhat rudimentary, lacking the high technology and the celebrity focus of later years. However, their core purpose was always the same: to terrorize and to control. The first annual Hunger Games were a raw, unsophisticated horror, yet they achieved the capital's initial goal. They established the ritual, they confirmed the consequences of the rebellion, and they introduced the annual spectacle that would come to define the identity of Panem. Over the next 74 years, the games would evolve from a simple punishment into a highly sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar media extravaganza, constantly adapting to maximize their psychological impact and ensure the uninterrupted rule of the capital. The institution of the games was the final, devastating stroke of the dark days, turning the trauma of the past into the defining, terrifying feature of the present. The initial installment of the Hunger Games, mandated by the punitive Treaty of Treason, was a far cry from the elaborate, high-technology spectacle the citizens of Panem would come to know. The first annual Hunger Games were a raw, unsophisticated horror, created solely as a barbaric assertion of the capital's ultimate power over life and death. This event, and the few that immediately followed, held almost no entertainment value for the capital citizens. They were primarily a grim, necessary ritual designed to confirm the subjugation of the 12 districts and to rub the defeat of the Dark Days Rebellion into the open wounds of the people. The environment of these early games was starkly different. The arenas were rudimentary, often taking place in natural settings that required minimal intervention from the game makers. There were no intricate, rapidly changing biomes, no elaborate holograms, and very few of the terrifying, genetically engineered mutations that would define later competitions. The capital simply chose a large enclosed area, perhaps a desolate ruin, a section of remote forest, or a mountainous region, and released the 24 terrified tributes into it. The emphasis was placed entirely on starvation, exposure, and pure, brutal hand-to-hand combat, stripping the violence down to its most primitive, agonizing form. The tributes themselves were barely prepared. There were no weeks of intensive training, no expensive capital coaching, and certainly no sophisticated stylists or presentation teams to transform the children into media stars. The tributes were often snatched from the reaping and immediately transported to the arena, given minimal instruction, and released into the kill zone. Their clothing was functional and bland. Their interviews were perfunctory and broadcast without the complex emotional manipulation of later years, and the concept of sponsors, where wealthy capital citizens could send in aid, was almost non-existent. This early format ensured that the children died quickly from starvation, exposure, or direct violence, maximizing the shock value and minimizing the logistical effort for the capital. This lack of spectacle, ironically, was a problem for the capital's long-term strategy. While the early games achieved the goal of terrorizing the districts, they failed to fully engage the capital's populace. The elite citizens, accustomed to a life of hyper-refined luxury and sensory overload, found the raw, unsophisticated brutality of starving children hiding in the woods to be tedious and depressing. The viewership numbers were low, the commentary was dull, and the games failed in their essential secondary purpose: to distract the capital citizens from political realities and internal dissent through the intoxicating medium of televised violence. The capital recognized that a punishment that only terrified the oppressed without entertaining the oppressors was an inefficient tool of control. It was this critical failure of entertainment value that led to the gradual, necessary evolution of the games over the following decades. The capital realized that to truly normalize the atrocity and make it an essential pillar of their society, they had to transform the games from a simple execution ritual into a media event, a dazzling, sophisticated reality show with high stakes, complex narratives, and compelling, albeit tragic, characters. This transformation required technology, money, and, most importantly, the development of a specific psychological playbook for manipulating the tributes and the audience. The entire future of Panem's stability, they determined, rested on making the murder of children a truly must-see television event, setting the stage for the arrival of new concepts, like the career tributes and the devastating impact of the 10th Hunger Games. The slow, necessary transformation of the Hunger Games from a rudimentary ritual of execution into a sophisticated media weapon began to accelerate around the 10th annual Hunger Games. This particular year marks a crucial, often overlooked turning point in the history of Panem, where the elements of spectacle and manipulation were finally understood and applied with ruthless efficiency. The narrative of this pivotal era is deeply intertwined with the youth and desperate ambition of Coriolanus Snow, the man who would one day become the totalitarian ruler, President Snow. Coriolanus Snow belonged to one of the original, powerful families of the capital, but his upbringing was one of profound, hidden poverty. His family had been financially ruined during the Dark Days Civil War, their wealth and influence decimated by the conflicts and the political upheaval. Snow's external appearance, his clothes, his home, his manners, was meticulously maintained to conceal this shame and destitution. This early experience instilled in him a deeply ingrained fear of losing power and status, and a profound understanding of the importance of perception over reality. He understood that in the capital, appearances were everything, and he was driven by a cold, calculating desire to restore his family's honor and wealth by any means necessary. At the time of the 10th Hunger Games, the concept of mentors, capital students tasked with guiding the tributes, was still a new and highly undesirable assignment. Mentoring was often seen as a political joke or a sign of bad luck. Coriolanus was assigned to mentor the female tribute from the deeply impoverished District 12, a young girl named Lucy Gray Baird. This assignment was considered a low point for Snow, as tributes from District 12 were famously weak and had never won, virtually guaranteeing his failure to win the prize of a university sponsorship that he desperately needed. However, the 10th Games were marred by chaos and low viewership, prompting the game makers to experiment with radical new ideas to boost the ratings and increase the psychological impact on the districts. The introduction of interviews for the tributes, a rudimentary form of sponsor support, and the early use of betting were all concepts tested during this period. The games were still held in a decrepit, natural arena, in this case, an old stadium that was quickly falling apart. But the capital was actively seeking ways to inject drama and personality into the bleak proceedings. The game makers understood that, for the games to work as propaganda, they had to create heroes and villains that the audience could invest in emotionally. Coriolanus Snow, driven by his desperate need for success, intuitively grasped this burgeoning shift towards media manipulation. He realized that his tribute, Lucy Gray, who possessed a natural captivating stage presence and a powerful singing voice, could be used to create the exact kind of emotional spectacle the capital craved. Snow did not train her to kill, he trained her to perform. He helped her cultivate her tragic romantic persona, urging her to sing on command and use her charm to garner the attention of the capital citizens. This marked a profound, insidious shift. The games were no longer about who was the strongest warrior, but about who was the most compelling performer. Snow's ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency in managing Lucy Gray's public image, and his willingness to break rules and sabotage others to ensure her victory, would not only save his family's financial standing, but also provide the capital with the exact blueprint for managing the spectacle for the next 70 years. His personal ambition became the cruel engine that drove the evolution of the games into a sophisticated tool of oppression. The 10th Hunger Games was a critical laboratory where the future of Panem's control was violently conceived. The core innovation that emerged from this period, largely driven by the insights of the young Coriolanus Snow, was the realization that sympathy and emotional investment were more powerful tools of oppression than simple terror. The early games failed because they only instilled fear. The 10th game succeeded by teaching the capital how to turn the murder of children into compelling, addictive entertainment. The initial stages of the 10th games were chaotic and deeply unsatisfactory for the capital audience. The first act of the games was nearly disastrous, when many of the tributes were held in a zoo where they were starving, dirty, and utterly unwatchable. This highlighted the major problem. The tributes were too pathetic, too anonymous, and too easily forgotten. The capital audience needed to know the story of the children before they died, transforming them from faceless district criminals into televised characters. This led to the permanent institutionalization of the pre-games interviews and the massive increase in the power of the mentors. Coriolanus Snow's success with his tribute, Lucy Gray Baird, proved the hypothesis. Lucy Gray's performance on stage and her highly emotional public displays, including a defiant bow and her heartbreaking, haunting songs, drew massive attention. The capital citizens, starved for genuine human emotion amidst their manufactured luxury, found themselves weeping for the District 12 girl, showering her with affection, and, crucially, sending her aid through the rudimentary sponsor system. This was the moment the sponsor system was truly born. The capital learned that they could monetize the audience's pity, transforming the act of sending medicine or food into a betting game and a transactional measure of affection. The audience was given a morally palatable way to participate in the games, feeling like benefactors rather than complicit murderers, all while the underlying brutality remained. Snow, in his desperation, also pioneered the idea of manipulating the arena itself. He was not a game maker, but his understanding of the tribute's psychology led him to suggest ways to increase the combat and the visual spectacle. The 10th games were defined by their intense brutality, including the intentional introduction of poisonous snakes into the arena, creatures created in District 13's former research labs, used as an early form of mutation. Snow's covert actions and suggestions demonstrated to the capital leadership that the game maker's role should be expanded far beyond passive observation. They needed to become active, sadistic directors, guiding the action, creating conflicts, and designing technological interventions to keep the narrative moving and the audience engaged. The most profound, long-term consequence of the 10th Hunger Games was the way it fundamentally changed the capital's view of the districts. Snow, having successfully turned a starving, anonymous girl into a national fascination, realized that the tributes could be weaponized. They were not just a yearly tax of lives. They were performers who could be used to sell the capital's ideology. By making the games addictive, spectacular, and emotionally manipulative, the capital ensured the annual ritual became an inescapable part of the national culture. The games were no longer a grim obligation. They were now a televised addiction that secured the loyalty of the capital and perpetually reminded the districts that their hope was merely a temporary, tragically entertaining illusion. Coriolanus Snow's ambition, therefore, directly led to the evolution of the games into the brutal, sophisticated tool of oppression that would last for the next 6 decades. Following the pivotal 10th Hunger Games, the evolution of the annual ritual accelerated rapidly, transforming the event into the elaborate, high-technology spectacle the world of Panem recognized. The capital, learning from the successful manipulation strategies pioneered by Coriolanus Snow and the desperate need for higher viewership, began to invest massive amounts of resources into the arena design and the science of oppression. The crude, natural environments of the early years were replaced by massive, custom-built arenas that were designed to maximize conflict, drama, and visual excitement. The game makers were elevated from simple overseers to highly specialized, almost godlike figures who wielded cutting-edge technology to actively shape the narrative of the games. They gained the power to control the environment on a minute-by-minute basis, deploying a terrifying array of technological interventions. This included the introduction of sudden, localized fireballs, massive, engineered electrical storms, devastating floods, and rapid alterations to the terrain, ensuring that the tributes could never rely on the environment for safety and that the audience was never bored. These arenas were not just battlefields. They were elaborate, customized sets for a perverse reality show, constantly changing to force the remaining tributes into direct, deadly conflict. The technological sophistication extended to the creation of terrifying, genetically engineered life forms known as mutations, or mutts. These creatures, often fused with the genetics of predators, but imbued with human-like intelligence and cruelty, were designed to be both frightening and deeply symbolic. They were a visible, horrifying testament to the capital's absolute mastery over science, proving that the capital could create life and death at will. The mutations served a crucial purpose. They were the game maker's way of actively intervening to kill weak or boring tributes, or to drive a lagging narrative forward, ensuring that the audience's attention remained fixated on the screen. The deployment of mutts was always timed for maximum dramatic effect, often introduced to coincide with the tribute's moment of emotional vulnerability or during a particularly tense standoff. Furthermore, the technology of holographic illusions was deployed to blur the lines between reality and simulation. The game makers could create terrifying yet illusory threats, such as phantom armies, walls of impossible fog, or auditory hallucinations to disorient the tributes, drive them mad, and prevent them from collaborating. This pervasive use of technology meant that the tributes were not just fighting each other and the elements. They were fighting the all-powerful, omnipresent capital itself, which controlled every single variable within the arena. This technological supremacy reinforced the core message of the games. The districts were powerless, and the capital was omnipotent. The development of these complex arenas also contributed directly to the rise of the career districts. Districts 1, 2, and 4. These districts already wealthier and more compliant than the others, began to prioritize the games, seeing them as a path to glory and comfort rather than a curse. Their citizens began to volunteer for the games, training their children from a young age in combat skills, weapon use, and survival, often in secret, illegal facilities. The capital, pleased by this level of commitment and the increase in professional spectacle it provided, largely turned a blind eye to this illegal training, effectively creating a semi-official class of elite tributes who were expected to dominate and elevate the bloodshed. This institutionalization of the career tributes further exacerbated the internal divisions between the districts, ensuring that even in the arena, the oppressed were fractured into classes of privilege and despair, all serving the capital's brutal entertainment needs. The political philosophy underpinning the Hunger Games is more complex and insidious than simple cruelty. The capital did not institute the annual ritual merely to punish the districts, but to manage and control the minds of two distinct populations, the oppressed districts and the privileged capital citizens. The games function as the ultimate engine of political stability, a sophisticated application of the ancient Roman doctrine known as Panem et circenses, which translates to bread and circuses. The purpose is to keep the populace docile and distracted, ensuring that the luxury and political power of the ruling elite remain unquestioned. For the capital citizens, the games are a form of mass psychological anesthesia. Their lives are defined by opulent excess, advanced technology, and a profound detachment from the harsh realities of the surrounding world. This lifestyle, however, could theoretically lead to political boredom, introspection, or even empathy for the districts, all of which pose a threat to the totalitarian regime. The Hunger Games prevent this by providing a perpetually compelling, high-drama spectacle that saturates the cultural landscape for months every year. The citizens become utterly consumed by the trivialities of the event, the tributes' costumes, the romance narratives, the betting odds, and the latest gossip from the game makers. This focus on the sensational and the superficial ensures that their attention is perpetually diverted from serious political and moral inquiry. They are so busy arguing over fashion and rooting for their favorite tragic victim that they never stop to question the fundamental injustice of a society built on the mass murder of children. Furthermore, the games foster a sense of moral righteousness and collective superiority among the capital citizens. By viewing the tributes not as children, but as characters, in a violent performance, often described as barbaric or savage by the commentators, the capital citizens distance themselves from the victims. They are led to believe that the games are a necessary, even civilizing, ritual that keeps the rebellious, criminal elements of the districts in check. The ritual allows them to participate in the violence through the sponsor system, where they can act as benevolent, distant gods, sending aid to their favored tribute. This transactional form of participation cleanses their guilt, allowing them to feel involved and charitable, even as they enjoy the televised carnage. The games are thus a sophisticated piece of social engineering designed to weaponize empathy, turning pity into a source of entertainment and political compliance. For the districts, the philosophy is one of perpetual terror and internalized defeat. The games are a yearly ritualized sacrifice that forcibly reminds them of the military defeat of the Dark Days. The public reaping ceremony, where the Treaty of Treason is read aloud, is a mandatory act of submission that forces every citizen to bear witness to the raw power of the capital. The cruelest psychological element is the necessity of mutual destruction. By pitting the children of District 4 against the children of District 9 in a fight to the death, the capital actively breaks down any lingering sense of solidarity or alliance between the oppressed regions. The people of the districts are forced to internalize the violence, making them see each other as competitors and potential enemies, rather than as co-conspirators in a shared grievance. This constant threat and mandatory complicity leads to a profound sense of learned helplessness. The districts are not just taught that resistance is futile, they are taught that even hope is dangerous. The rare victor, celebrated and returned home, serves a dual, malicious purpose. They provide a fleeting, cruel illusion of hope that keeps the people marginally compliant, and they become a permanent, tormented symbol of the capital's power, forced to live their lives as the traumatized, controlled beneficiaries of the very system that destroyed them. Ultimately, the Hunger Games are the capital's magnum opus of political control, using spectacle to paralyze the privileged and using terror to divide and conquer the subjugated, ensuring the dystopia remains perfectly stable. The quarter quells represent the terrifying, escalating punctuation marks in the otherwise routine 74-year history of the Hunger Games. While the annual games serve as a constant reminder of the district's defeat in the dark days, the quarter quells, which occur every 25 years, are deliberately designed by the capital to be far more brutal, spectacular, and politically significant. They function as a deliberate, massive amplification of the ritual's original purpose, tailored to specific historical anniversaries and designed to further shock and intimidate the entire nation of Panem. The concept of the quarter quells is established directly within the Treaty of Treason itself, ensuring that they are not arbitrary additions, but an integrated part of the original punishment. The treaty mandates that every 25 years, the capital must introduce a special twist or a severe rule change to the games, specifically chosen to honor a past period of the conflict or to remind the districts of the price of the rebellion in a particularly devastating way. This rule change is typically revealed on the day of the reaping ceremony, ensuring maximum surprise and psychological impact on the vulnerable district citizens. The 25th Annual Hunger Games, the first of the quarter quells, was designed to explicitly commemorate the initial end of the Dark Days Civil War. The special twist was intended to remind the districts that they themselves were directly responsible for the rebellion and the ensuing death. The rule change for this quell was uniquely cruel. The districts were forced to vote on which children would be sent to the arena, rather than selecting them randomly by lot. This twist was a devastating act of psychological warfare, forcing the communities to actively choose which of their own children would be sacrificed, shattering their solidarity and burdening the surviving families with the profound, paralyzing guilt of their complicity. This forced participation ensured that the districts could never truly unify in shared grief, as the blame for the sacrifice was made internal and local. The 50th Annual Hunger Games, the second quarter quell, was designed to honor the capital's alleged massive military victory and their total suppression of the rebellion. The twist for this year was a horrifying numerical increase in the sacrifice. Twice the number of tributes were reaped from each district. Instead of the usual 2 tributes, each of the 12 districts was forced to offer 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, to the arena, resulting in a total of 48 tributes fighting to the death. The sheer scale of the bloodletting was meant to demonstrate the capital's overflowing power and its willingness to sacrifice massive numbers of district lives to maintain order. The increased number of tributes ensured that the games were exceptionally brutal, confusing, and visually overwhelming, serving as a massive propaganda statement about the capital's unchallenged military dominance. These special quarter quells were not just about increasing the body count, they were about redefining the terms of the oppression. They served to underscore the message that the capital was not constrained by routine. It could change the rules, escalate the violence, and create new, personalized tortures whenever it deemed necessary. They are the periods when the capital most actively intervenes in the ritual, ensuring that the spectacle remains fresh, terrifying, and profoundly effective as a tool of political submission for everyone in Panem. The quells guaranteed that every generation of district citizens would experience at least one event so profoundly traumatic that it would reinforce the lesson of the dark days with unparalleled horror, ensuring their continued obedience until the next 25-year cycle. As the Hunger Games evolved from a crude execution ritual into a sophisticated media event, the role of propaganda and image manipulation became utterly central to the Capitol's control strategy. The key to the game's long-term success was the ability to transform the unwilling child tributes from victims into characters, making them relatable enough to attract sponsors, yet ultimately disposable enough to be killed for entertainment. This transformation was primarily achieved through the specialized and insidious work of stylists, mentors, and the media team. The stylists were perhaps the most visible agents of this manipulation. Their task was purely political: to erase the poverty and identity of the districts and reinvent the tributes as dazzling, exotic celebrities. The clothing the tributes wore during the opening ceremony and the interviews was not merely fashion, it was a potent form of propaganda. The costumes were designed to be elaborate, dazzling symbols of their district's industry. For example, the coal workers of District 12 were presented in dramatic, shimmering flames, but they were also designed to remove the image of the starving child. By turning the tributes into beautiful, stylized objects of art and fashion, the Capitol made it easier for their citizens to forget the reality of the impending slaughter and treat the entire event as a sporting competition or a fashion show. The mentors, former victors from the districts, who were forced to return to the Capitol every year, had the cruelest job. Their primary role was not to ensure their tribute won, but to ensure their tribute put on a good show and survived long enough to secure sponsor donations. They were tasked with coaching the tributes on how to appeal to the Capitol audience, how to be charming, how to be defiant, how to cry on cue, and how to create a compelling, tragic love story or a narrative of vengeance. The mentors taught the tributes that their only chance of survival lay in performing their trauma for the audience, turning their grief into a commodity. This system guaranteed that every victor remained perpetually chained to the ritual, forced to become agents of their own oppression, furthering the Capitol's cycle of emotional abuse and control. The media team and commentators played the crucial role of interpreting the events for the vast Capitol audience. They controlled the narrative, framing the violence in the arena as either heroic, tragic, or necessary. Any act of rebellion or dignity by a tribute was quickly reframed as a predictable display of district savagery, while the interventions of the game makers, such as releasing fireballs or mutations, were presented as justifiable acts of restoring order or elevating the excitement of the competition. This relentless commentary and narrative control ensured that the Capitol citizens viewed the games through a distorted, carefully curated lens, preventing any spark of genuine dissent or sympathy from taking root. This entire apparatus of propaganda created a sophisticated, televised psychological barrier that stood between the horror of the reality and the comfort of the Capitol's conscience. The tributes became living, breathing symbols of the Capitol's power, used to sell an ideology of fear and submission, even in their final, dying moments. The fact that the Capitol could force its victims to look beautiful while they were being slaughtered is the ultimate cold genius of their totalitarian rule, ensuring that the Hunger Games remained the most effective, self-perpetuating tool of oppression in Panem. Despite the overwhelming technological supremacy, the ubiquitous propaganda, and the annual terror of the Hunger Games, the Capitol never entirely extinguished the spark of rebellion ignited during the dark days. Over the 74 years of the Games, a quiet, pervasive underground resistance continued to simmer within the 12 districts, fueled by the constant brutality and the enduring memory of their ancestors' defiance. These early acts of resistance were not military uprisings, but subtle, symbolic gestures of defiance, designed to maintain hope, preserve the truth, and slowly rebuild the sense of unity that the capital had deliberately fractured. One of the most important forms of resistance was the illegal transmission of history and forbidden lore. In the technologically focused District 3 and the transportation hub of District 6, small, secret networks risked their lives to maintain unauthorized communication channels. These channels were used to share genuine news of conditions in other districts, exchange medicinal knowledge, and, most crucially, pass down the true, unsanitized story of the dark days and the courage of the original rebels. This covert sharing of history was critical, as it fought back against the official capital propaganda and ensured that the younger generations never truly believed the lie that the capital was invincible or that the districts were meant to be eternally subservient. Symbolism became the silent language of this resistance. The mockingjay, a bird that resulted from the unplanned crossbreeding of the capital's own surveillance, jabberjays, with ordinary mockingbirds, became the most powerful, unintentional symbol of defiance. The mockingjay, which could not be controlled by the capital and instead repeated human speech and melody, was a perfect symbol of the capital's flawed technology and the impossibility of crushing the human spirit. The symbol began to appear subtly in carvings, on stitched fabrics, and in the artwork of the districts, a covert visual pledge to the future of the rebellion. The Hunger Games themselves, despite being the ultimate tool of oppression, also inadvertently became a source of resistance. Every rare act of mercy, sacrifice, or open defiance by a tribute in the arena was immediately seized upon by the districts as a symbol of hope. These moments, broadcast nationwide, were often the only times the districts saw an act of genuine, selfless humanity, confirming that the spirit of rebellion was not dead. The most powerful symbol was the three-finger salute, a gesture of respect, gratitude, and farewell used in District 12. This salute, often seen at the reaping, became a quiet, unified sign of shared resistance and mourning that was understood by all the districts, despite the capital's attempts to frame it as simple grief. The network of victors, the men and women forced to live in the victors' village and return to the capital as mentors, also played a complex, double-edged role. While they were instruments of the capital, their unique access and their shared, profound trauma allowed some of them to become reluctant, hidden allies. They possessed the only legal means to travel and communicate between the capital and their districts, providing a crucial, if dangerous, conduit for information and the eventual planning of the larger, final revolution. The entirety of Panem, therefore, stood on a knife's edge, the capital confident in the power of its spectacle, and the districts, particularly the impoverished and perpetually exploited District 12, harboring a quiet, growing rage. The stage was set for the 74th Annual Hunger Games, where one small, symbolic act would finally expose the fragility of the capital's control and ignite the second, final rebellion. The history of oppression had prepared the people. All that was needed was a single spark of true, unscripted defiance.